What's going on, guys? It's Frito here for your Overwatch. Season 5 is underway, and the changes, I think, were quite positive. The game's fairly balanced, but there's a few really heavy outliers that's going to change the way you play entirely. We're going to start off with the damage category this time because it's the one that's had the most transformative changes. Starting out with the S tier, going to get it right out of the way. Cassidy is unreal with this new Magnade. So Magnade now travels long distances. Granted, it is on an awkward arc, but I don't find it too hard to hit, even at medium range, because of its attach. The explosion damage, granted, isn't so significant, but it would be like if Hack could explode. It would be ridiculous if Hack alone did damage, right? Without needing any follow-up. Magnade is basically like a Hack in function. They can use cooldowns offensively against you, but because they are slowed and can't use movement abilities, all of a sudden now we have given one character the single strongest anti-mobility cooldown in the history of the game. Yes, even better than GOAT's era Brig. I think this is better because back in Overwatch 1, when Brig was at her heyday, yes, a decent Brig could zone out one Tracer, made Tracer unpickable, but I think this Magnade is useful in a much wider array of matchups. At the moment, it is bugged to do things like cancel Junkerqueen's ult. I'm gonna assume that doesn't stay in, and the ability may get honed over time when there's certain exceptions put into place, but at the moment, if you get hit by Magnade as a Tracer, you are fully screwed. No abilities, no recall, or blink, which I found a little bit surprising because I wouldn't have considered recall a movement ability technically. I suppose it moves you, but I thought of it more of like a self-cleanse heal type thing. So again, it's going to be tricky to find out what they're ultimately going to leave, but at the moment, it feels just about everything counts. Some surprising outliers are like Wrecking Ball can stay in his roll form, but can't use his grappling hook to gain speed. Movement passives are disabled, which in some cases they aren't with Hack, and in general, I just think it's really easy to hit, reliable, and sets up for follow-up shots from Cassidy and his team. It's good against everything. Mobility heroes, but also tanks won't be able to escape in the time when they're affected by it. So try to focus on just getting this Magnade in an important spot with your team as you can fight them. And oh yeah, another big benefit for Cassidy is he already fit in a lot of the medium range characters that were good, and snipers got nerfed. But particularly Widowmaker, you'll find that she'll be way down the tier list, and because Widow is nerfed at certain ranges, Hanzo reemerges as the top sniper in the game. Not only does he have a decent matchup against Cassidy, a lot of the mid-range brawler heroes he's still good against. Granted, he can't one-hit kill a 250 health point character, but there's only so many of them, and Hanzo's damage type, he does have follow-up damage with Storm Arrow anyway, and it's not like Widow where I feel all of her damage just vanishes if you don't get that one headshot. Like Hanzo just keeps spamming arrows repeatedly, so his damage uptime is just fine against Brawl still. And I think you'll notice as we go through the tier list, a lot of the other characters in the list either have weak matchups against these two or are kind of like budget versions of these two. They're both very strong at medium to close range, and to be honest, with the buffs to Cassidy's range or with the potential long range of Hanzo, they kind of don't have a weakness other than maybe vertical mobility, but that hasn't really necessarily been a need in a lot of situations. Maybe if you're taking map, don't have a flanker on your team, once in a while that job is required, but for most things on most maps, we've got a lot of medium range lanes to fight on, whether it's on control or push, so you don't have to think too hard about your map control. Now, into the A tier, we're going to have some of these characters that are also good at medium range near the top. I'm putting Sojourn and Ashe way at the top of A tier because they have similar playstyles to Cassidy and Hanzo. As the game gets more medium range and spammy, without so many one-shot pickoffs, I think Sojourn's like a different version of Hanzo, and Ashe is slightly more range than Cassidy, but her ability isn't as good. Possibly her ult is better. They're kind of competing at the same ranges. I will say the big benefit these two have is the mobility to easily get to different areas of the map a bit faster than their counterparts. Skipping down a bit, we'll look at Mei, who's a character that I'll admit I'm not very good at, I don't think, and I was very reliant on the overpowered freeze ray, and I'm going to say, in my opinion, Mei, for players that aren't skilled with the icicle, is quite a bit worse in this version. She's quite amazing when paired with Cassidy because that's another crowd control piece. She's going to be amazing in team play, and I think maybe even at higher tiers of play where the tank matchup is really well understood and the focus fire is a bit better at like GM plus, but as like a solo queue hero, I think Mei is kind of meh in terms of being able to carry. An important thing to note that her freeze ray pretty much allows for a one-shot kill to the body. It was previously kind of thought and implied that she would need to headshot like she did in Overwatch 1, but that's not actually true. true. While there is a perfect frame that you could possibly shoot the icicle at the perfect moment that the freeze effect applies, and they survive with just a few hit points, but for the most part, the freeze effect lasts long enough and you're probably going to shoot the beam long enough that you'll do enough damage to one-shot combo a squishy with that. I just think it's kind of slow, to be honest. Like, I think it rivals the time to kill of the previous freeze ray and didn't require you to hit a shot. So while yes, the slowing effect going up to a ridiculous, is it 50%, I believe, is nuts, I think that affects tanks more, and that just sort of will change which tanks are even applicable. So someone playing a bad tank, Mei's gonna feel super easy. But as soon as you stop outplaying the tank, I think everything else is just sort of medium range on you, and I wouldn't consider her much better. Other flanker heroes, mobility in the lineup. Tracer did get nerfed. I can barely tell the spread difference, to be honest, and considering the snipers got worse, although she is kind of weak to Cassidy and Hanzo, because they both have really good answers for her, she also has enough blinks to potentially outskill it. So against most other things, if someone even dares to pick Widow on Havana, I feel you can probably get away with just playing Tracer. She still has the positioning and teamwork and just general good Overwatch character abilities that keep her pretty high on the list. Reaper's a slower version of Tracer who holds his ground more and against certain tanks can fight them better, but struggles to contribute anything meaningful to the medium range pickoff battle that's happening at the higher end of the tier list. Flankers and flyers, projectile heroes and flex, bit of a skill matchup here. I think they counter some heroes below them, and I almost put Genji a bit higher because I think of these options down here, he can kind of fight Cass and Hanzo decently. Just not so sure if they have great matchups against other parts of the game. I think you might expect Sombra to be significantly worse due to Magnade, but I don't think Sombra players should reliably be getting hit by it in the ranges and positions they play. I will note, I think like there should be maybe 2 tiers of A tier here, split off at the middle. There's kind of a big matchup gap in the A tier. Going into the B tier, I'd say these have some decent matchups, and the more of a specialist you are, you can get them to perform as some of the higher tier options. Bastion, Soldier, Torb, Sim, Junkrat. Remember, the game is more medium range now, just in general. So in some instances, you'll feel that these can out damage Cassidy, possibly, by playing a little bit farther away or in crafty positions. But Magnade is just more reliable than any of the other CC out of like Sim or Junk. And a lot of this, so the entire tier list makes sense because Widow is all the way at the bottom. I'm gonna say only specialists should be trying to play her, probably only on the good Widow maps as well. Hitting heads is still possible at like the break of the fight. Going for picks, what you lose as Widow now is like the spawn trap angles that really would dominate her performance. She still does part of her play style. It's just hard to really suffocate the enemy team from map control. And once the enemy starts gaining map control, all these other heroes kind of come online when they're able to flank or jump on the objective. Widow kind of needs you to not get on top of her. Widow was already a bit overrated for like average tier players. I have to put her as even worse now, as there's many shots you would like to take that just won't net you in a kill anymore with the range decrease going to 50 meters for a 200 health point target. Remember, the range begins to fall off at 40 meters, and that's where she does 300 damage because she has a special modifier on her headshot, but it's already under 200 once you get beyond 50 meters. The game is quite different now, and maps you remember that used to be Widowmaker dominant as soon as the enemy has a good Widow on their team play entirely differently now. She might get some picks at some ranges, but it's hard for her to keep up with how many picks she'll need to get because there's certain positions she won't be able to advance to meaningfully. I think Widow players will adjust over time, but for now, before you know where all the break points are going to be for your distance, you're going to find yourself contributing too little over the course of multiple fights, where all the other characters have like cooldowns that instantly do things for their team. Now onto the tank tier list. This is going to be affected by 2 principles. Snipers are far less important, and crowd control is. There's some of the tanks that get hit by a Magnade and kind of just don't become a character anymore. But playing alongside medium to close range brawler characters like Mei, Cassidy, etc., I put Ramattra as number 1. I'd say, funnily enough, even though he has super long range staff damage, it's not really enough to help in a sniper battle. His shield is limited in its positioning, so snipers could always get around it, either headshotting him or someone else. Well, now you don't really have that threat as Ramattra to kind of be walking in, taking space, and getting headshot from a Widow. The game's more in your range and playing alongside a lot of the best characters. Ramattra is the best at slow attritional gameplay, either to defend himself or to go aggressive once your team begins to get an advantage, because because he has the best ability to deal damage through shields in the game, using Nemesis Form's Pummel. If this was a higher tier list, I might put Junkerqueen significantly higher. Yes, she got nerfed where her ult and shout are worse, 50 less health on the commanding shout, and a significant ult charge decrease. I think in general, the skill you need to play Junkerqueen is so high that most players aren't specialist enough on the very narrow skill set that she has in order for her to be like advisable as a top tier, easy A tier pick for everybody. I think Ram is a little bit more plug and play. Also keep in mind at the moment, her ult gets canceled by Cassidy, who you're going to see all the time. So if that never gets fixed, you can just put her all the way down in the C tier, I think, as heroes that are basically useless because Cassidy exists. But my anticipation is that will be changed and she will raise in power. Above her on the tier list is Rein, Orisa, and D.Va, who I all think have strong defensive options against being targeted. This brawly frontline presence who can play defensive is quite key. I think the tank probably is easiest to play defensive, which is why I kind of put Ram above them, but their options too. D.Va mostly for high ground, Rein and Orisa depending on your ability to outplay the disables. I think Orisa especially is like a sleeper pick for me because if players just keep playing Cassidy and you have one on both sides, if your tank can be kind of immune from that CC effect and the enemies can't, you're likely going to make a pretty big advantage there. Zarya in theory fits within those principles, but I just think really slows down her potential against some of the picks I have at the top, remembering that she is still kind of nerfed from previous versions in the early release of the game, for example. A lot of her numbers just kind of take a while to get going, but with skill she can raise. Kind of the same story with Sigma right now, where I think he wants a slower game, so part of that is good, but he doesn't like brawling really at all. On maps where there was a sniper duel happening, he had some pretty intense front range damage and a shield, which is kind of a rare combo, so his win rate was insane for a while. I just don't know if you're gonna ever feel like you must play him. If you're good at him, definitely he's fine. I just think he's one of the tanks who's a little bit more easy to isolate from Mei, for example. If you see a lot of spam characters, using Kinetic Grasp to farm up a lot of life can be good. For me, I think he's just a bit more of a generalist, and I think this meta is gonna promote a bit more commitment to a certain team comp. Winston's hanging around in there. Try to keep in mind that they buff some healing values, particularly from Lifeweaver, and while he does have a shield to defend himself against some of the disables, I think with the game slowing down, more than likely, the other tanks being able to do more damage is gonna matter. But as you can tell, I think the game is pretty balanced. Like, to have this many heroes at the top two tiers, you should have the opportunity to play quite a lot of things, except for the C tier. Yeah, we just jumped the B tier entirely. Doom, Wrecking Ball, and Roadhog are like laughably bad in my opinion right now, because the Magnade and freeze changes harms them the most. It already was easy to land a Magnade on Doomfist in the previous versions. Now it disables and slows him. And while Hog did get a buff where he has extra healing received after taking a breather, he's just got a big wide open belly to get hit by freezes, Magnades, and everything in the world. Those medium range characters were already good at brawling against Hog, and with them just being better and him not having a one shot, did you forget that? I don't think like healing your tank matters all that much when the other tanks have so much health and survivability as it is, and also like defense for the team oftentimes. So I'm gonna say you need to be a specialist to play any of these. I could see Wrecking Ball maybe making the cut to be a higher tier pick, but again, I just think that there'll be more difficulty than they're worth unless you've already invested a ton of time in them and are experts at them. Overall, remembering of course, Junkerqueen kind of has the all-in offensive tank category on lock. So it's pretty tough for even these ones with mobility to challenge that if you play Junkerqueen right, because her peak potential when she gets in space is significantly higher than the damage output, at least consistently, from these. The nerfs she got, I don't think are enough to throw her off her game completely. And even if she wasn't taking that role, I still probably think you'll have an easier time on all the other tanks we mentioned. Onto the support category, we'll say at the top of A tier is Zen and Kiriko. I feel like I'm always like higher on Zen as a rank up hero than most people, but I think now that you can kind of have a fortress of a team comp around Zen, and you can think of how weak I think Dive is in general, walking around with a Discord, which is going to help your team's focus fire immeasurably in a meta that has lockdown abilities pretty prominent, you can make the tank's life miserable on the enemy team. And both with Zen and Kiri, because snipers are worse, their range damage is kind of nutty. Only Hanzo rivals them. Think about that. They're big winners in the longer range damage battle, which is kind of scary considering their supports. And Kiri also has a lot of super enabling comps that are good in the meta. She really extends the life of Junkerqueen and her potential, but can fight off most things. I was always a little tricky trying to rank Kiriko for the average player because in fact, her win rate isn't great at most tiers of play, but I think once you master the kunai and try to focus on going for pickoffs, like maybe somewhere between 30 and 50% of the time, which wasn't my advice like at launch. I said you want to heal like 90% of the time based on how strong it was. Now the game has shifted around a bit where you do need to play her like a duelist a lot of the time. So you do have to hit shots. I think that's why she doesn't perform necessarily at a lot of tiers, but I think if you master her in this meta, there's certainly options for you. I almost put Baptiste higher on the list because I think he is the go-to support hero for these medium range brawl comps that exist, maybe even in the S tier for the higher tiers of play, to be honest. But I find that for most tiers of play where the positioning is worse, you end up needing to get more value out of his primary fire attack. And I just think there's better heroes, all the ones above him, at that job. Baptiste is a multitasker who can output some serious pressure damage and win some duels. It's just a little bit harder than I think some of the other supports. If you got a DPS, there's better DPS options, though he is competent at that. Mercy, try to remember that having damage amp actually extends the range of your Widowmaker. So if there is a Widow battle going on and your team has a Mercy and theirs doesn't, it isn't just the charge rate that you got a buff on from before, because before you could quick scope the enemy Widow faster with damage amp. Well, now there's a distinct range advantage where even at a full charge scope shot where the enemy Widow has your Widow dead to rights, if she's out of range, she will not die and the others can. I also think the flying heroes have some place. They counter Mei pretty well. Mercy on a Cassidy isn't the best pairing in the world, but it's not terrible either. She's a bit better with like Ashe, for example. Plenty of decent DPS for Mercy to get value with, but a bit harder if you're forced to assist other teammates. Brigitte. There was a bit of a controversy on the big rework that happened when she regained her stun, but lost other things. Overall, from my perception, I think Brig players have adapted to the new way she functions. And while I don't think she's a necessary pick, she can kind of double down in some of the defensive playstyles and make it even easier to keep your Cassidy up. With enough flanking and enough dive, Cassidy might get overwhelmed, but a Brig whip shot added in there and some instant pack healing. She can lay damage in when the magnate hits in front of her. She plays pretty well with that, but it's hard to rank her above the medium and longer range options that you have to take over the game with DPS. Now into the B tier, I am going to put Lucio and Moira. Lucio does have an S tier comp with Lucio Kiriko playing with Junkerqueen. I just think most players don't really know how to play Lucio Kiriko that well. And there's a lot of comps where Lucio feels like he's not contributing enough when other heroes can kind of just go take their position and are holding nukes in their back pocket. Lucio's a lot more complicated and plays the team game, which isn't so required to rank up. Also keep in mind, he loses all his abilities when he gets magnade, so it's not like you're going to find it so easy to overwhelm a Cassidy if he hits you with that. Moira kept getting buffed, but I still think she's just an easy option. Reliable value, farms up a lot of stats that often don't add up to much. Focusing on pressure first like a Kiriko can be decent, but she just has gaps in her game without a cleanse and without any range. Not a bad pick, but neither is Lucio technically. It's just the other supports are so insane that I think it's hard to pick these often and feel like they're always the best choice. Just fine and B. Down here in the C tier, we're going to put Lifeweaver, who received a ton of buffs, actually. I was quite optimistic on the character from release, but it turns out that his playstyle just simply isn't fitting in Overwatch 2. I do think his buffs have created some niches that you can exploit, for example, up against an enemy Winston with your escapes, as well as the massive amounts of healing you give now. 75 per flower is quite a lot. Some of these lower damage type picks can feel they both can't really get on a good Lifeweaver player or kill his team due to his healing buffs. But you need that like exact matchup for him to feel useful, because that's like his one play. One of his best teammates in the entire game is Cassidy. So I'm still quite optimistic on Lifeweaver, but I think if I said all that for the B tier above him, that you need the right matchup, the right teammates to perform for you, I think that just goes double for Lifeweaver. If the enemy has bad targeting or weaker picks, Lifeweaver can succeed. I just think despite his buffs, his offense is still quite terrible, and all the support heroes in the game contribute meaningful offense. Even Mercy, because damage amp is incredible for breakpoints for the team. Lifeweaver is only defense, which means on defense, where you don't necessarily need to kill things, but maybe just dodging engages and escaping out of the ult fight might really drain the objective timer for the enemy. But I think that's only on paper payload and hybrid. On control especially, but also push, I think, it's really hard to have a pure defensive playstyle and win because kills always get traded out and you're going to need to be able to contribute to offense at some point. Whereas on like hybrid and payload, it's often like big full team fights, big full regroups, less scrappy deathmatching. I honestly think Lifeweaver is one assault or 2 CP game mode away from being good. It's just we don't play maps like that anymore. So I hope they add some interesting utility to his kit to keep him in line with the other characters in the game. That's everybody on the tier list, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave it a like and don't forget to hit subscribe and click the bell icon to actually get notified when our videos come out. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. I'll see you guys next time.